we're taking another perspective on a lot of the same material, and we're layering in some new elements in the set. First, before we go any further with first responder procedures, I want to thank Don Murdoch. He has helped me with a large portion of this module of the course. He's an expert in first responder procedures. He understands the need for forensics to capture information to make an organization better defend itself. And that's what first responders are all about from a computer security or an information security standpoint. First responders within forensics is a little bit different. When you think of first responders, think of EMTs, the people, the emergency medical technicians that arrive on the scene. What is their job as an EMT? Is it to do facial reconstructive surgery? Is it to set a bone? Well, no, it's to stabilize the patient for transport to a larger facility where there are more capable people on site. Okay, so now let's step back for a second and let's say that somebody's laying in the street and they're bleeding and a doctor walks by. Is that doctor capable of doing facial reconstructive surgery? Well, maybe, they may be capable of that. They went to regular medical school and they can do first responder procedures right then and there. So if you are the senior incident handler and you see something where you have to collect that evidence, you are then the first responder. So what we want to do is we want to say, okay, how do we take that forensics concept, tell people who are there at the beginning of the event, if you will, or possibly an incident, and tell them how to react to the situation until we get there. Stabilize, in this case, the patient is a computer. Stabilize the patient until an expert arrives. If it is an expert that is arriving on the scene, they're doing the exact same thing that you are, they just have a lot more knowledge. What our job would be is to look at those other people in the organization that are going to be the first responders and say, do you want to learn how we can better facilitate operational effectiveness, making us more secure? And they go, well, what does forensics have to do with making us more secure? I'll tell you what it has to do with it. If I can collect the evidence to figure out what went wrong with the computer, maybe it's a malware incident. If I can figure that out and I can say, hey, if we did faster virus updates or if we did faster patching of our machines, the evidence that I collect will allow me to go back to management and say, management, it has happened 3 times where we've been infected with this stuff, and if we would have spent a little bit more money automating our patch management process, this would have not cost us the losses that we've had from these particular incidents. So we're stepping back out of the business at this point, saying we need some help in making and updating our procedure. Now we're going to dive down in and just focus on first responder for forensics practices first. So we're going to take forensics and incident response and bring them together, talk about the questions that are required, creating a first responder toolkit. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about packaging the evidence and keeping this simple for the people that are actually doing this. We've talked a little bit about packaging before. Deal with a report for the crime scene. Now think about it. If the EMT were to see the body there and they were to take the pulse, the blood pressure, the temperature, all of those vital signs, they would have to communicate that to the hospital and to the person who's actually taking the handoff. And you'll hear them in certain shows where they'll call in all the statistics about the patient before that patient gets there. Well, that's reporting on the status of this particular computer, if you will, instead of a person. So We'll also talk about the common mistakes so that we can avoid those pitfalls, and when we do training, that training is good. And then we're going to talk about computer incident response and how to bring the two together. So let's look at who the first responder is. Well, it's you and me. It's help desk. We got to talk about the procedures, those first responder people, and the role of the first responder as opposed to the incident, as opposed to the forensics investigator. So the first responder is the first person on the scene. They're going to look at that victim's computer because the victim says, I have a problem, something's wrong with my machine. Or they might even say, the internet's down. And that's the end of it for them. Well, what did you see on your machine? I didn't touch the machine. Okay, now, as a first responder, we have to change things a little bit. We have to be prepared for the fact that somebody doesn't want to be blamed for something that went wrong. It's very different than a patient that's laying on the ground, because when an EMT walks up on the scene, there's usually somebody there coming to the aid of the other person that's laying in the street. The EMT says, what happened here? The person that's standing there next to the body goes, it's not me, it's not my fault. They don't do that. They go, well, I saw this guy riding a bike, he got hit by a car, and the car drove away. You know, they're kind of helpful in it because they don't feel like they made a mistake. They're trying to aid in the situation. When somebody's more interacting with a computer and actually working on it, they think that, oh, I blew up the computer, I did something wrong. And so therefore they have a lot of denial there. So usually what we'll talk about is the possible first responders come in a couple of different flavors here. First, it's systems administrators, people who don't have forensics training, that are just there to keep the machine running. What does a systems administrator do when a person has a problem? Well, they reboot the machine to clear it out and reset everything on the machine. What did they just do to our evidence? They just cleared some of our evidence away. These are non-forensic people. That's not their job. In an operations facility, uptime is the winner, not figuring out, oh, let's look at this hexadecimal or this image or anything. No, none of that stuff. How do I get this machine running so this person can get back to work? So what are they supposed to be doing as first responders? Now, think about it. This is the small portion of forensics that we're focused in on acquiring the evidence to go back to a lab. So they're going to secure and evaluate the crime scene. They're going to go ahead and cordon it off with the yellow tape, if you will, virtual yellow tape. They're going to figure out those preliminary interviews of the people that are there. Usually in this interviewing process, your job, more than anything as a first responder, is to calm that person down, collect their information, relax them, and don't make them feel defensive, and say, hey, look, we're going to fix this together, and make it easy on them. They're going to document as much as they possibly can at that moment in time. My friend Bill Lardusky, what he does is he used to have this set up in his lab where when there was a failed machine, what he would do is he would send a technician out. While the help desk person is talking to that person on the machine, if it's failing for some reason or causing problems, they're talking to him, they're collecting the information, and they're calming them down. Meanwhile, a tech is actually taking a new machine to that location. If in this phone call, after 3 to 5 minutes, they can't actually have a resolution to the problem, the tech is on the scene with the new computer. That tech swaps out the boxes. He doesn't document the evidence because he's worried about uptime. But if he would just take a minute to photograph the screen, to look at the connections and collect up all the connection information that's going on there, if they would do maybe a flash of the RAM at that moment in time before they disconnect the machine, they could get some critical evidence out of this. They could document what was going on with the machine and then go ahead and take that next step. So collecting and preserving, for Bill's team, it's great if it's not memory resident. They pick up that other machine, they drop it on the cart, they put the new machine down, and the person is up and running again. Now what they have is a machine that is dead at this point. It's static information because they unplugged it. Couldn't they do something like we talked about before? What could they do to this PC to make this work in this situation where they wouldn't lose that RAM? theoretically, they could set the card up with a UPS device underneath of it and figure out a way to set up all the plugs for those particular machines to have hot swapping power supplies so that they could plug in another power supply, unplug the first power supply, keep the machine running, and then cart it off successfully while it's still running. Now that would be a lot of work to do for an individual PC. From an operations standpoint, that may be way too much. So flashing the RAM and then sending the machine into suspend mode or hibernating the machine. Remember, that means that the machine has to understand the hibernation mode. Setting up the machine beforehand, especially if it's a Windows machine, with a snapshot of the data, system volume. They could even go over to virtual machines and say, okay, well, this is a virtual machine issue, and we'll capture a snapshot of the virtualization that's going on at that moment with all of the RAM. They've got to set up some sort of procedures. So let's just talk generally here. If a crime occurs that affects the company's servers or individual workstation, the company first contacts the forensics laboratory or the agency of crime investigation. Get to that person that knows what's going on. And so what we're doing in first response is we're saying we're notifying you that we believe we have an event. And then the first responder has to have the knowledge of the computer forensics investigation procedure. I need to know what they're going to do so that I don't mess up their part of this thing. And that's the first set of the procedures that we deal with.